So I'm Isabel Costa, and I'm from Portugal. And I decided to do this presentation because I participated on Google Summer of Code last year. You'll know more about it next. And I just want to share my experience, maybe to help other Google Summer of Code aspirants and share whatever I learned from open source and this whole experience. So that's it.
Would you like me to pose the poll?
Yeah, sure. So let's start. So I just want to get a feel of who is interested in applying this year for Google Summer of Code, and to know if you know what Google Summer of Code is. So yeah, can you answer the poll, please?
So poll has been launched. Please put your questions, put your answers in, and we'll just wait a few more seconds. I think we can close the poll and see the results. Okay, now here we go. So
okay.
there's yes.
Cool.
2 people answered yes, 2 no.
Okay. I'm glad most of you know what Google Summer of Code is because it's the major portion of the title of this talk. So okay, so now I'll start off. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, but maybe you want to put it in a...
Yeah, the presentation.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, just as I said before, I'm Isabel Costa, and I'm here to talk about Google Summer of Code. A short summary of what I do. So I'm a software developer. I was a student last year for Google Summer of Code with Sisters community. I'm an open source enthusiast in a way that I learned about open source and its potential. So now I just really like it, and I want to continue to contribute and spread the word on it. And I'm a maintainer at Systers Open Source now for the projects I worked in during Google Summer of Code. So for the ones who don't know what Google Summer of Code is, it's basically a program where Google matches organizations and mentors and students. Students will work during a 3-month period, 12 weeks, on a project in an open source fashion, so it's all public. The mentors volunteer their time to help the student out. And just a little thing, for Google Summer of Code has 3 phases. So once a student is accepted, has 3 phases to pass the evaluations. And the program is only completed if the student passes the last evaluation. I'll let you know more about that later. So the first thing is to research organizations and projects. Once I knew about this program, I started to look at organizations, more specifically for Android projects, because that's where I was working on at the time. So these are some of the organizations. Every year, Google chooses about 200 organizations. And Sisters was among them. And I was looking first at 3 main organizations. So Open Data Kit, Open Food Facts, and Sisters. And I ended up choosing Sisters because I identified with their mission of helping women in tech. I felt welcomed in the community. They had a lot of projects besides Android. So I felt I could learn a lot about any sort of tech stack they used, not only Android, and I could help in other ways besides coding. So After choosing an organization, and this doesn't have to be like that, right? You can focus on the project, on the organization. For me, it was easier to focus first on the organization, because I really wanted to narrow down my search, because I was working and doing my master thesis. So I really needed to focus on something instead of looking at a lot of projects and proposing to a lot of them. So at Sisters, they had Power Up, which is an application for pre-adolescent girls to learn about reproductive health. And I thought about Power Up because there was an Android project, and it was one of the ideas that Sisters shared to the students so that they could propose something for the application. But I didn't end up applying to this project because I didn't see a lot of room for me to contribute. So, for example, I tested the application, and all the bugs I would find, they were reported. The issues were all taken by a lot of students, and there was a lot of competitiveness. So I decided to come up with an idea. I decided to come up with an idea also because Sisters was open for original projects, and I really wanted to start a project from scratch. So I decided to look at my own experiences, and I noticed that one of the things that I really like to do is to share knowledge. Share some knowledge that I feel that sometimes people might not be aware of. For example, I mentored during college for first-year students. I also met some people who are transitioning careers, and I try to help them out just to know some things about the tech industry, something that I learned along the way. So I thought, what can I do with this, right? So how can I find more people to share knowledge with and also learn from them? So I decided to think of a project to help women in tech mentor each other during a certain period of time about career development topics. And what I mean by career development topics is, for example, optimizing the LinkedIn profile, setting up a GitHub profile, reviewing the CV, public speaking, blogging. There's a lot of things, right? So because Android was my passion, I decided to, okay, I want to build a mobile application that helps people find mentors and mentees and to learn about these topics. So I started crafting the proposal at this time. This was before the application phase. So Google Summer of Code has, once the organizations are announced, there's a phase, there's an application phase, but there's a time before the application phase actually starts to give time for students to research the organizations and start choosing which ones they want to focus on. So I started crafting the proposal once I got the idea. And the proposal is basically a document, right? Sisters had a template for that. With some questions that the students should answer about the background, the experience with open source, experience with remote work. And they had a space to explain the project. And that's where I was free to write whatever I wanted about my idea. So I did a mock-up. Once I started brainstorming the idea, I started see it visually and see, okay, so I can do this app, I can have members screen, I can have the mentorship agreement screen. So I just did this mock-up design on draw.io, and put it on the proposal. I also started thinking and writing down all the features that I thought, right? Some features that weren't implemented and are in the feature development thought for the future of the project. So I just brainstormed and wrote everything that I could about it. And I also started writing about the timeline. The timeline is a place where you say what you want to do in each week. So during those 12 weeks, you should tell the mentors and the admins what you're planning to do, because Google Summer of Code, it provides a lot of autonomy to the student, right? So you have some freedom, in fact, a lot of freedom. You are proposing what you want to do during these 12 weeks. And Google Summer of Code requires a full-time commitment from you. So the proposal has to be well thought of. So besides that, besides crafting the proposal, I also engaged with the community. I tried to learn more about the community, and some ways that I contributed to the community was through helping other students that came in later than me, because I knew a bit more about Google Summer of Code than them, and a bit more about the community. I tested projects. I tried to report bugs and things that I would find. And I also participated in SAC discussions and community open sessions, which are not restricted to the GSOC program. The community open sessions are weekly calls, remote calls, that anyone from the community can join to discuss things about Systers Open Source. So then the application phase started, and at this time I could submit my proposal, which I did the first day, and right in the first day I had gotten some reviews. So one of the things I did in the application phase was pitching the idea. I pitched the idea in one of the community open sessions that I mentioned. So I did some slides to present what was the benefit of the app for the community, what I was thinking for the whole product. And actually during this session, I got really real valuable feedback from the community. And one of the things someone told me was about already existing apps. And at this time, I felt a bit bad because I didn't do the research. I was so caught up in this idea and so excited that I didn't actually did a research for it. So then I took some time and I actually did the research, and I started understanding more about the benefits of this project, right? So I wanted this project to be open source. Most of the mentorship applications that exist out there are either paid or target just students or focus on technical aspects. And I wanted a bit of the opposite of that, right? Because I wanted to focus on career development topics. I wanted on other sets of skills. I wanted this to be an open source project. And I wanted this to not focus just on students, but on people from all stages of life, right? So there's people transitioning careers to the tech industry, and they may not be college students and still need help on getting their first foot out in the industry. So I really wanted this to be an open source effort and open to anybody, not just for students. There was also an interview during the application phase. So I did a group interview where I had to ask some questions, just like in the proposal. There could be technical questions, although I don't remember. I think I didn't have technical questions, but there was one question which was really important and then really reflected on in the end of my journey, which was, what would I do if the timeline short? I have time to things that I proposed. So at the first, so just that, I wouldn't like work extreme hours to finish the product, right? I would respect my health and just prioritize tests. We don't have to do everything. This is open source. I would do my best. I would respect the full-time commitment, but at the same time, I would respect my time and my mentor's time and my admin's time, and we would prioritize tests, which I did in the end. So the proposal, during this whole phase, I had the group interview, I pitched the idea, but the proposal was always open for review from mentors and admins. So I got a lot of reviews, and by reviews, I mean, the proposal was in a Google Docs comment, Google Docs. So mentors would comment there if they had any issue with the question or the way I was explaining the project. So every time I got a comment, I would act upon that. And this was really helpful because I submitted the proposal since day one. By the end, I didn't have much to add. So some of the improvements I made to the project were regarding the timeline, the explanation, more of the explanation of the product. For example, I had to explain, I remember a mentor, and I think it was one of my actual mentors. He asked me if I had experience with backend development, right? So he confronted me because I was too focused on the Android application. Then he asked me, so what about the backend? So then I started thinking about the backend, and I started thinking about the data model and the database, how it would look like. We would have user entity, which could be a mentor or a mentee. I started thinking about the actual attributes that would be stored into the database. I improved the timeline, but this was a really important part, right? Because if I didn't get that review, I wouldn't have thought about the backend, which was actually most of the work that I did during Google Summer of Code. Was working on the backend that later was used for the Android application. So without backend, we wouldn't have a working Android application. So I improved the timeline as well. And one of the suggestions that I got was to allocate some buffer time, right? So imagine if any emergency would happen and I would need a week off. Having a buffer time would help me caught up to work. And also in the timeline, I had to explain, I had to mention my limited availability. So because I was working and doing my thesis, the first weeks would be low in terms of work. So I had to explain that. And besides all that, right, so I continued to improve the proposal. I did the interviews and I pitched the idea. I also continued to contribute to the community, right? And this was during the application phase and even after, because when the application phase ends, there's a time, like 2 weeks before the students are announced, the accepted students are announced. So I just continued naturally contributing to the community how I could. So because I was already coding a lot on the thesis and the work, I tried to focus on other set of contributions. For example, I created the Google Docs for the community open sessions. We didn't have that before. And this was a really good way of, if someone didn't attend the community open session, that person could know, could learn more about what happened at the session without having to go, right? I continued to participate in the Slack discussions. I brought up a discussion about organization of the GitHub Wiki sidebar for all projects to be consistent and so that newcomers could better index the information. And also I thought of other ways to improve documentation, right? Because there was a lot of, for example, there was a lot of documentation for PowerUp, but it was also a bit scattered, right? Between Google Docs, the GitHub Wiki, blog posts. So I really thought about other ways to improve the community. So the day came and I was accepted to Google Summer of Code. And by this time I was really thrilled, but at the same time, a full-time commitment to this has started. this was my last month of work, so I could match better the schedule. So now was the time, then was the time to for the community bonding. And community bonding is about getting to know more the community, the mentors you're working with, the admins, the open source workflow. So it was time to understand, for example, the student and mentor expectations. So there was a doc, very, very helpful, that admins prepared for student and mentor expectations. And this really helped me understand what was expected of me, right? So we had 3 evaluation phases. If we didn't meet the accepted expectations, right, we would be in risk of failing a certain phase. So knowing the mentor expectation was also helpful, right, to set the expectations for the student. I also, during this time, created an interactive app wireframe. So what I showed you from the proposal was just an image, but then I created an interactive way of clicking buttons and getting to another screen. I also had the first meetings with the mentors. I refined a bit more the database model I had prepared at the time. And I got familiar with the tools that we were going to use, that I will talk a bit more later. So regarding the student expectations, we had a lot. So a lot of the expectations were timely, right? So there were some basic things like respecting the code of conduct, communicating in public. This was really mandatory, right? Communicating in public for the community. But there were some timely stuff. For example, we had to submit 3 Scrum check-ins, which is just a little text that I will show you next. 3 Scrum check-ins on Slack, 3 days a week, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We had also to write a weekly report on Fridays. And on Mondays, we had to publish a blog post. So these were really timely. And then I understood that by respecting these times, we would be sort of obligated to communicate, right? So trying to imagine not having these deadlines, we would have a lot of freedom to either speak a lot or not speak at all. This always depends on the student, but I found that having these deadlines was really helpful. So a Scrum check-in would be something like this. So I would have to answer 3 questions. What I did since last Scrum check-in, what I was going to do for the next Scrum check-in, and what was getting in my way. So this was really helpful to keep me accountable and also share my progress with the whole community, mentors and admins and other fellow students. I saw a lot of the Scrum check-ins from my other colleagues. I would check them out just to have an idea of what they were doing. So this is a Scrum check-in. Tools. So this was really a working environment in the sense that we had clear tools that we would use. For example, Slack for written communications, Zoom and Hangouts for video calls, email for some specific communication. For example, when a student was a bit absent on Slack, the admins could contact them through email. For work, we used mainly GitHub because that's where the projects are. My tech stack was mainly Python using the Flask framework, Kotlin, and the Android framework. In terms of organizations, this is just a very set of tools. For example, Google Calendar was used to know about the deadlines that we had for Scrum check-ins, blog posts, and all of that. We would use Drive to store Google Docs, slides, all the information that we gathered from the program. I would create there some documentation about the project. For example, Google Docs was where we wrote down everything for each weekly meeting. So after the community bonding phase, we started the coding phase. And by this time, we would have to be already familiar with mentors and admins and the community so that we could now focus on coding the project. So the first phase, I focused a lot on the backend. So because I didn't have experience in building backend from scratch, I had to learn Flask since the beginning. I just used it once, for example, during the crafts of the proposal. I had to, a mentor requested me to show if to show a simple REST API using Flask, right? To show if I could learn that by myself. So I focused a lot on the backend, on building the first REST APIs, of setting up the project. I learned about the open source workflow, right? So this was the time that mentors guided me on how we would collaborate together on GitHub. And also getting used to the deadlines of blog posts, weekly reports, Scrum check-ins, weekly meetings. So this was really an adaptive phase. So after this phase, I passed the evaluation and I continued to the second phase. And then I continue to work on the backend API. Just click on the data model. There was some to refine the database model we had set up before. And I also presented a short demo that would serve as documentation and a test demo to prepare us for a final demonstration that we did on YouTube Live. So after the second phase that I also passed, the third phase began, and I had to start working on the Android project, but the backend had also to be stable, So at this time, I did a lot of things. I defined the minimum functional product to prioritize tasks. So the main tasks that I had to do. I started building the initial screens, but more in the end of the program. I studied a bit about application architectures used in the Android ecosystem, and other things related to code. I built some test cases that I'll show you here. So I built a test cases for wrote test cases for all of the APIs that I've created by that time, so that I could help other people from the community contribute to the project by testing and reporting bugs. I actually solved some very critical bugs that were discovered by other contributors because of also this documentation. I also did more design, right? So those initial mockups that I did was really low fidelity, and this was better representation of what the app would look like, right? So this is an example of an image that I put together to share with the community and to ask for feedback, right? So I had two options and I wanted to know, okay, what is the better option to choose here? So there was a lot of community collaboration, right? And by the end of GSOC, I was thinking, I'm doing just code. I did design. I was already managing insurance tasks. I even wrote a post to promote the project for interested people interested in the mission of the project and open source. And I did a lot of documentation. So documentation, I tried to do it since day one, right? One really important thing in this program is, for example, if students then have to go away, the project has to continue, right? And there has to be a share of the knowledge that was built during the program. So for documentation, I did a lot first on Google Docs, and then after GSOC, I was transferring from Google Docs to the GitHub Wiki. The meeting minutes Google Docs was documentation because I wrote everything on the meetings about what we discussed, the mentors, the admins, the blog post. My blog post specifically worked also has documentation because I chose to document what would happen during the week. So that could also be considered as documentation. And I also kept two Google Docs, one for backend and one for Android, where I would update information specific to either the mobile application or the backend. So now I was at the end, the final weeks, I had to wrap up the project. And in the end, we had to submit the final code and a final report, right? So I had, besides finishing some tasks, I had to document feature work. I had to write the final blog post from the set of blog posts that we wrote every week. I had also to present the final demo on YouTube and complete the final evaluation. So this was a really intense last weeks. So after Google Summer of Code ended, so right after, right, I passed the third phase. I finished the program with success. I became a maintainer of a mentorship system, the project I proposed, because I already knew a lot about the project. So I just asked, hey, can I become a maintainer? And the community manager let me be a maintainer. I finally took some time to rest, right? Because those were some intense 12 weeks. And I also was nominated as the most outstanding student within the students of the Sisters community that year. So this was a really good end for GSOC. So now some final thoughts, right? Because this was a really intense experience, I learned a lot through it. One of the most important things that I learned is that open source is not just about code. Whenever I heard about open source, and even nowadays, when people talk about open source, they talk a lot about contributing with code, submitting PRs to a project. And I really liked to learn that it's not just about code, it's about people, it's about documentation, it's about quality assurance, it's about building software together. And that has a lot of layers, right? Software has to be tested, documented. In open source, it's not like in the workplace where you may have a colleague next to you that can answer you your doubts. So there's a lot of open source that's more than code. I can be in the community for 3 months, not coding at all, and still contributing to open source. Reviewing pull requests, doing design, helping maintainers manage issues, help people learn more about the community. Other thing that I learned is that open source takes a lot of effort, right? So in open source, not all projects function the same way. Not all maintainers maintain a project the same way. Not all communities function the same way. So you might arrive to a project that maintainers are either very responsive or less responsive. You can have a lot of documentation, very low documentation. So sometimes this requires a lot of effort if you really want to contribute to a project, and you may have to search a bit on your own ways to solve a certain issue that the project has. So this takes a lot of effort, both from a contributor standpoint and a maintainer standpoint. I discovered as well my passion for documentation. And when I say passion, it's just that I give a lot of importance to documentation, right? Because if I went away, if I stopped being in the community, for example, because I started out the project, there had to be some documentation for people to continue to contribute to the project. So documentation is really important for very reasons. I also learned that remote work is a powerful thing. So I really liked working remotely. I got to work in my hometown, but I had some struggles. It was good. It was very good having a lot of flexibility. But at the same time, because I was so excited about the project, and sometimes I had a little pressure to meet certain deadlines or to do a good work. I wanted to finish the program with an application working. It wasn't easy to unplug from my work. So, for example, when you work on site, most people can finish their work, go home, and not think about the work anymore. Because I was working from home, it was a little harder to separate things. So I would think about work even when I wasn't supposed to work. But at the same time, remote work gives so much flexibility, and yeah, if you use it well, it's good. Okay, but you have to have a lot of discipline. So now the impact it had on my career. So besides all the things that I learned, there were some other things that came as a consequence from this whole program. So I went represent Sisters Open Source community and my project on Open Source Day of Great Hopper Celebration, which is a conference in Houston, Texas. So I went to America for the first time. I also learned how to develop a REST API. So I learned a lot about the concepts of a REST API. I became an open source maintainer. I did 2 public talks, one at a local meetup and another at a conference, because I had so much that I wanted to share about open source. And I also met some incredible people, right? From the mentors to the admins. Mentors helped me a lot. They did working sessions with me. I really, this really made my experience great, and I still talk to them after the program. I also was very impacted by my GSOC admin. I really learned a lot from her. And yeah, I got to meet a lot of people since Google Summer of Code, and got to share my experience, and for me, that's great. Sharing knowledge. So yeah, this is it. This is the end. So if you want to know more about my journey, there's a Medium publication where I wrote all of my blog posts. I have my weekly reports on the GitHub wiki of the 2 projects I work with, Mentorship Android and Mentorship Backend. And all my Scrum check-ins are public in the Google Docs on my weekly, on my GitHub wiki page, which is in the Mentorship Backend. If you want to know more about Sisters Open Source, you can go to sisters.io. You can go to GitHub and check Sisters organizations. They have a lot of projects. We also have a Medium and a Blogspot. So yeah, there's a lot of information that I can share with you. So yeah, this is the end. Now you can ask me some questions if you'd like, and thank you for coming.